Act 3. The Eternal Consequence. In the throne room of Hades, where shadows gathered like living things and time moved according to laws that bore no resemblance to mortal chronology, Sisyphus stood before powers that had governed the cosmos since its first dawn. The silence that filled the vast chamber was not merely an absence of sound, but a presence unto itself, weighted with the accumulated judgments of ages and the finality that awaited all mortal striving. Hades himself studied the prisoner with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, measuring the worth of yet another king who believed himself exempt from the common fate of humanity. The Lord of the Dead had seen countless rulers arrive in his realm, each convinced that earthly achievements would translate into special consideration in the afterlife, each discovering that death rendered all mortal distinctions meaningless. Sisyphus of Ephyra, the god's voice resonated through the chamber like the settling of mountains. You stand accused of crimes that exceed the normal bounds of mortal transgression. You have betrayed divine confidences, violated the sacred laws of hospitality, and bound death himself in chains that disrupted the fundamental order of existence. How do you answer these charges? For a moment that seemed to stretch across eons, Sisyphus remained silent, his mind working with the desperate precision of one who faced absolute judgment. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, everything he had learned through decades of careful observation and manipulation had led to this moment. The skills that had made him legendary among mortals seemed pathetically inadequate when measured against the cosmic authority that surrounded him. Yet, even in the depths of his apparent helplessness, Sisyphus recognized that he retained one advantage that neither divine power nor supernatural wisdom could entirely negate: his understanding of psychology, mortal and immortal alike. The gods, for all their might, remained subject to the same emotional currents that drove human behavior. They could be flattered, convinced, even deceived by one who understood their particular weaknesses and desires. "Great Hades, Queen Persephone," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had served him through countless negotiations. "I do not dispute the charges brought against me, for I have indeed committed acts that merit divine displeasure. Yet I would ask for the opportunity to explain the circumstances that led to these transgressions, not to excuse them, but to place them in their proper context." The audacity of requesting time to present a defense in the throne room of ultimate judgment would have struck most observers as evidence of madness or supreme arrogance. Yet Sisyphus had built his entire career on calculated risks, and he understood that even divine justice operated according to procedures that clever advocacy might influence. If he could demonstrate remorse, if he could present his crimes as misguided rather than malicious, he might yet escape the worst consequences of his actions. Persephone leaned forward slightly, her interest apparently piqued by the mortal's unexpected approach. The Queen of the Dead had heard countless pleas from souls seeking mercy or clemency, but few had possessed the sophisticated rhetorical skills that Sisyphus displayed even in his extremity. Her voice, when she spoke, carried undertones of curiosity, mixed with the terrible authority of one who ruled over the final destination of all mortal journeys. "Speak then, clever king," she said, the title carrying implications that transcended mere acknowledgement of his earthly rank. "Let us hear how mortal wisdom explains actions that shook the foundations of divine order." But speak quickly, for eternity offers many fates, and few of them reward those who waste our time with empty words. Here was the opening that Sisyphus had hoped to create, the moment when divine attention focused upon his words rather than his crimes. With the skill of a master craftsman shaping precious metal, he began to construct the argument that would either save him or seal his doom forever. "Your Majesties," he said, allowing just the right amount of humility to color his tone, "my crimes began not with malice, but with love. Love for my city, my people, and my family. When I witnessed the abduction of Aegina, I saw not an opportunity for profit, but a father's grief that demanded justice. Sisyphus sought his daughter, and I possessed information that could reunite them. Was it wrong to ease a parent's suffering, even if doing so inadvertently violated divine privacy?" The argument was masterfully constructed, reframing his betrayal of Zeus as an act of compassion rather than calculated treachery. By emphasizing the emotional aspects of the situation while downplaying his material motivations, Sisyphus sought to transform himself from villain into tragic figure, one whose good intentions had led to unfortunate consequences. "As for binding death," he continued, allowing genuine regret to enter his voice, "I acted from mortal terror rather than divine defiance. When Thanatos appeared to claim my life, I was not ready to abandon those who depended upon my protection. My people, my wife, my children, all would suffer if their king were suddenly taken from them. In my desperation to provide for their welfare, I committed an act that I now recognize as the height of presumption." The plea was carefully calculated to appeal to Persephone's own experience of being torn from loved ones, her understanding of what it meant to be separated from those whose welfare mattered more than one's own comfort. If he could establish emotional connection with the Queen of the Dead, if he could make her see his actions as misguided love rather than arrogant ambition, he might yet achieve the impossible. Hades listened to this performance with the patience of one who had heard every possible variation of mortal self-justification. Yet something in Sisyphus's approach seemed to give him pause, perhaps the sophisticated understanding of divine psychology that the mortal displayed, perhaps simple curiosity about how far such cleverness might extend. "Your words are skillfully chosen, Sisyphus," the Lord of the Dead acknowledged, "and your remorse appears genuine. Yet actions carry consequences regardless of their motivations, and the disruption you caused cannot be undone by eloquent explanations. What punishment do you believe appropriate for crimes of such magnitude?" The question was both trap and opportunity, testing whether Sisyphus would attempt to minimize his guilt or demonstrate true understanding of his situation. His response would determine not only his immediate fate, but the eternal consequences that would define his existence in the realm of the dead. "Great Hades," Sisyphus replied, "I acknowledge that my crimes merit severe punishment, and I am prepared to accept whatever judgment divine wisdom deems appropriate. Yet I would ask for one consideration, not as a plea for mercy, but as a matter of cosmic justice itself." He paused, allowing the weight of anticipation to build before delivering the argument upon which everything depended. "Your Majesties, I died without proper funeral rites. My wife, in her grief and confusion, failed to perform the sacred ceremonies that ensure peaceful passage to the afterlife. My body lies unburied, my spirit dishonored, my soul denied the dignity that even the humblest mortal deserves in death. The claim was audacious in its complexity, requiring Persephone to believe that Merope's failure to perform funeral rites was accidental rather than deliberate, that Sisyphus himself was the victim of this oversight rather than its architect. Yet the argument touched upon fundamental principles of divine justice that even the rulers of the dead could not dismiss lightly. In the silence that followed his words, Sisyphus felt the full weight of divine consideration pressing upon his consciousness. Persephone's eyes had narrowed slightly, her expression revealing the internal struggle between sympathy for apparent injustice and suspicion of manipulation. The moment stretched beyond normal time, filled with currents of supernatural thought that would determine whether his final gambit would succeed or fail. "This is a serious claim," Persephone said at last, her voice carrying undertones that Sisyphus could not entirely decipher. "If true, it represents a fundamental violation of the proper order that governs passage between life and death. No soul should be denied the dignity of appropriate burial, regardless of the crimes committed in life." The Queen of the Dead turned to consult with her husband, their conversation conducted in tones too low for mortal ears to follow. Sisyphus waited with the forced patience of one whose fate hung upon words being spoken beyond his hearing, knowing that his entire future depended upon Persephone's interpretation of cosmic justice and her willingness to grant what appeared to be a reasonable request. When the divine consultation ended, Persephone's expression had shifted toward something that might have been compassion mixed with determination to see justice properly served. She faced Sisyphus with the authority of one whose decisions shaped the destiny of souls, her words carrying the weight of cosmic law itself. "Sisyphus of Ephyra," she pronounced, "your crimes are grave and merit severe punishment. Yet cosmic justice requires that all souls receive proper treatment in death, regardless of their failings in life. You shall be granted temporary return to the mortal world, but only for the purpose of ensuring that appropriate funeral rites are performed and that your passage to the afterlife follows proper procedures." The conditions she attached to this unprecedented mercy were specific and binding, designed to prevent the very kind of abuse that Sisyphus was secretly planning. "You will have 3 days to correct this oversight," Persephone continued, "after which you must return immediately to face the judgment that awaits you. Fail to honor this agreement, and the consequences will exceed anything that ordinary justice might impose." As the queen spoke these words, Sisyphus felt a surge of triumph that he carefully concealed beneath an expression of appropriate gratitude. His plan had succeeded beyond his most optimistic calculations, achieving not merely a reprieve from judgment, but an opportunity to return to the mortal world where his advantages would be restored. The clever misdirection that had convinced Persephone of his victimization rather than his manipulation represented perhaps the greatest achievement of his legendary career. "Your Majesty's wisdom and mercy exceed my worthiness to receive them," he replied, bowing with exactly the degree of humility that would reinforce her belief in his sincerity. "I swear by all the gods that I will use this opportunity only to ensure proper funeral rites and to prepare my soul for whatever judgment divine justice deems appropriate." The oath was carefully worded to appear comprehensive, while actually promising nothing that would prevent him from pursuing his true intentions. Sisyphus had learned long ago that the most effective deceptions were built upon technical truths that concealed deeper layers of manipulation, and his pledge to Persephone followed this principle perfectly. The return journey to the mortal world was accomplished with divine swiftness that compressed distances and collapsed the boundaries between realms. One moment, Sisyphus stood in the throne room of Hades. The next, he found himself materializing in the familiar surroundings of his palace in Ephyra, breathing the sweet air of the living world and feeling the warmth of sunlight on skin that had been touched by the absolute cold of death. The city around him continued its daily operations much as he had left it, though the eternal spring that marked his bargain with Asopus now carried additional significance as proof that divine promises, once made, endured regardless of the circumstances that had prompted them. Citizens went about their business in the marketplace. Ships arrived and departed from the harbor, and the complex machinery of commerce that he had so carefully constructed continued to function even in his absence. Yet Sisyphus had no intention of wasting his precious time on municipal administration or commercial oversight. He had achieved the impossible, a second chance at life itself, and he meant to use every moment of that opportunity to its fullest extent. The 3 days that Persephone had granted him were merely the beginning of what he intended to be a much longer reprieve from divine judgment. His first action was to locate Merope and ensure that she understood the success of their carefully coordinated deception. His divine wife had played her role perfectly, allowing her genuine grief at his apparent death to convince the powers of the underworld that her failure to perform funeral rites was accidental rather than deliberate. Now she would need to maintain that pretense while helping him plan the next phase of his resistance to cosmic authority. The reunion between husband and wife was both joyful and calculated, their embrace carrying the genuine emotion of lovers separated by death, while their whispered conversations focused on the practical details of maintaining their deception. Merope had prepared well for this moment, spreading word throughout Ephyra that her husband's funeral had been delayed due to the complex political arrangements required for a king's burial. The explanation satisfied most observers, while providing cover for the extended delay that Sisyphus's plans required. As the first day of his reprieve passed into night, Sisyphus stood once again upon the battlements of his palace, looking out over the city that his cunning had built and the waters that had brought him both opportunity and doom. The familiar satisfaction of successful manipulation filled his consciousness, though now it was tempered by the knowledge that even greater challenges lay ahead. He had tricked death and deceived the queen of the underworld herself, but those victories would mean nothing if he could not find a way to avoid returning to face the judgment that awaited him. The solution, when it came to him, was both elegant and audacious in its simplicity. Persephone had granted him 3 days to arrange proper funeral rites, but she had not specified what would happen if those arrangements proved impossible to complete. If no funeral could be conducted, if circumstances beyond his control prevented the very ceremonies that had justified his return, then logically he could not be held responsible for failing to fulfill conditions that had become impossible to meet. The plan that began to form in his mind was complex enough to challenge even his legendary skills in manipulation and misdirection. He would need to create circumstances that appeared to prevent his funeral, while actually orchestrating every detail of the apparent obstacles. Political crises would need to be manufactured. Religious authorities would need to be convinced of various complications, and the entire process would need to appear natural rather than contrived. Over the following days, Sisyphus set his plan in motion with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all his greatest achievements. Disputes arose between rival priests about proper funeral procedures for a king who had died under supernatural circumstances. Political tensions emerged between neighboring cities that made large gatherings dangerous. Technical problems developed with the sacred materials required for royal burial rites, creating delays that seemed beyond any mortal's ability to control. Each obstacle appeared independent and natural, the result of ordinary complications rather than deliberate manipulation. Yet together they created an impenetrable web of difficulties that made it impossible to complete the funeral rites within the allotted time. As the third day dawned and passed without resolution, Sisyphus allowed himself to believe that he had achieved the ultimate victory over divine authority itself. But the gods were not so easily deceived, and Persephone's patience, while considerable, was not unlimited. As the third night fell without any sign of Sisyphus's voluntary return to the underworld, the Queen of the Dead began to suspect that her mercy had been repaid with manipulation rather than gratitude. The realization that she had been deceived by mortal cleverness filled her with a cold fury that shook the foundations of both worlds. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years as Sisyphus continued to evade the divine summons that should have called him back to judgment. His success in avoiding his fate became legendary throughout the Greek world, inspiring both admiration and terror in those who heard the tale of a mortal who had twice cheated death and showed no signs of accepting the inevitable. Yet even as he enjoyed his extended reprieve from divine justice, Sisyphus began to notice subtle changes in the world around him that suggested his victory might be less complete than it appeared. The eternal spring that had marked his bargain with Sisyphus continued to flow, but its waters gradually took on a metallic taste that spoke of deep corruption. The prosperity of Ephora remained substantial, yet new ventures failed with increasing frequency, as though the very luck that had favored the city was slowly turning against it. More disturbing still were the dreams that began to plague his sleep, visions of divine councils where his continued defiance was discussed with growing impatience and mounting anger. In these nocturnal revelations, he saw Zeus's rage at being twice humiliated by mortal presumption, Hades's cold fury at having his authority challenged, and Persephone's bitter regret at allowing herself to be deceived by sophisticated manipulation. The dreams carried an undertone of inevitability that no amount of conscious reasoning could dispel, a sense that forces beyond mortal comprehension were aligning themselves for a final reckoning that would brook no further delays or clever evasions. Yet Sisyphus continued to resist the growing pressure, clinging to his freedom with the desperation of one who understood that surrender would mean not merely death, but eternal punishment beyond imagination. The end, when it came, arrived with the swiftness of divine justice, finally unleashed after years of supernatural patience. Hermes appeared in Ephyra not as a messenger bearing ultimatums, but as an agent of absolute authority whose arrival marked the conclusion of all negotiations and the beginning of final consequences. The god manifested in the throne room of Sisyphus's palace during the morning court session, his presence immediately recognizable to all who witnessed it, yet carrying an aspect of terrible finality that had been absent from previous divine interventions. Where Thanatos had come as executioner and Ares as captor, Hermes arrived as the personification of divine will that could no longer be delayed, defied, or deflected. Sisyphus, the messenger god, spoke with a voice that carried the authority of Olympus itself. Your time of grace is ended. Zeus has decreed that no further delays will be tolerated, no additional schemes will be permitted, and no more mercy will be extended. You will return with me immediately to face the judgment that has been postponed too long already. The words carried a finality that admitted no possibility of argument or negotiation. This was not a death sentence that might be evaded through clever tricks or supernatural intervention, but the simple statement of cosmic law that had finally decided to assert itself with absolute authority. The game that Sisyphus had played with divine patience was over, and the time for accounting had arrived. As Hermes spoke, Sisyphus felt the last vestiges of his legendary confidence finally abandoning him. The mind that had conceived schemes to outwit gods themselves now faced the reality that some forces truly were beyond mortal manipulation. Some authorities genuinely immune to clever words and sophisticated misdirection. The king of Ephyra, master of countless negotiations and architect of impossible victories, finally understood that he had reached the limits of what cunning could accomplish. Yet even in that moment of ultimate defeat, even as he felt the inexorable grip of divine justice closing around him, like chains forged from cosmic necessity itself, Sisyphus maintained the dignity that had defined his entire extraordinary existence. He rose from his throne with the bearing of one who had ruled wisely and well, who had built something magnificent from nothing but ambition and intelligence, who had dared to challenge the very foundations of divine authority and had come closer to success than any mortal had a right to expect. I am ready, he said simply, the words carrying both acceptance and defiance, surrender and pride. Let us finish what was begun so long ago. The return journey to the underworld was accomplished without ceremony or delay, Hermes's divine authority removing all obstacles and eliminating any possibility of escape or diversion. This time, there would be no clever words to create opportunities for manipulation, no sympathetic audiences to be swayed by sophisticated arguments, no weaknesses in divine psychology to be exploited for advantage. The throne room of Hades seemed unchanged from Sisyphus's previous appearance, yet the atmosphere that filled the vast chamber was fundamentally different. Where before there had been the formal procedures of initial judgment, now there was the cold certainty of final sentencing. Persephone's expression carried no trace of the sympathy that had allowed his previous escape, and Hades himself radiated the terrible patience of one whose mercy had been exhausted through deliberate abuse. Sisyphus of Ephyra, the Lord of the Dead pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. You stand before us not as a first-time offender seeking justice, but as a repeat transgressor whose crimes have compounded through deliberate defiance of divine authority. Your deceptions have exceeded the bounds of what any power mortal or immortal, can be expected to tolerate. The catalogue of his crimes that followed was comprehensive and damning, encompassing not merely his original betrayal of Zeus and binding of death, but his manipulation of Persephone's mercy and his years of illegal residence in the mortal world. Each transgression was detailed with the precision of divine memory that forgot nothing and forgave nothing, building toward a judgment that would reflect the full magnitude of his accumulated offenses. For crimes that exceed the normal bounds of mortal transgression, Hades continued, punishment must exceed the normal fate of ordinary souls. You who sought to bind death shall be bound yourself. You who disrupted the natural order through cleverness shall labor eternally without achievement. You who believed mortal intelligence superior to divine wisdom shall learn the futility of effort without divine blessing. The sentence, when it was finally pronounced, was both terrible and elegant in its symbolic appropriateness. Sisyphus would be taken to the deepest pit of Tartarus, where the most heinous criminals received their eternal punishments, and there he would be given a task that would occupy him for all of time, without possibility of completion or reprieve. A great stone would be provided, its weight calculated to require the maximum effort that his spirit could sustain without being crushed entirely. This boulder he would be required to push up a steep mountain, straining against its massive bulk with every fiber of his eternal being. Yet the stone was enchanted with divine justice that ensured its weight would always exceed his strength by the smallest possible margin, so that he could move it slowly upward through supreme effort, but never quite achieve the summit. At the moment when success seemed finally within reach, when the peak of the mountain lay mere inches away, the enchantment would activate and the stone would roll backward with inexorable force, tumbling down the slope to return to its starting position. Then Sisyphus would be compelled to begin again and again and again, for as long as time itself endured. The punishment was designed with exquisite precision to mirror his crimes, while providing eternal reminder of their consequences. His cleverness, which had served him so well in achieving temporary victories, would become a curse that allowed him to understand the futility of his labors while being powerless to escape them. His pride, which had led him to believe himself capable of outwitting divine authority, would be ground down through endless repetition of meaningless effort. As the sentence was pronounced, Sisyphus felt the last remnants of his legendary composure finally cracking under the weight of cosmic justice. The mind that had conceived schemes to deceive death itself now contemplated an eternity of labor without purpose, effort without achievement, striving without hope. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm his consciousness, the habits of a lifetime reasserted themselves, and he began to search for possibilities of escape or mitigation. But the journey to Tartarus revealed the hopelessness of such thinking with crushing finality. The deepest pit of the underworld was designed to contain the most dangerous criminals in cosmic history, its walls built from substances that existed only in the realm of divine justice, its guards drawn from forces that could not be bribed, deceived, or overcome through any mortal stratagem. The mountain that would become his eternal workplace rose before him, like a monument to futility itself, its slope calculated to provide maximum difficulty, while remaining theoretically possible to ascend. The stone that awaited him at its base was indeed massive beyond normal comprehension, yet not so large as to make effort obviously pointless. Hope, that cruelest of divine gifts, would remain with him always, ensuring that each attempt would be made with the desperate belief that this time might somehow be different. As Sisyphus placed his hands against the boulder for the first time, feeling its weight and texture and the terrible solidity that spoke of permanence beyond mortal understanding, he experienced a moment of clarity that revealed the full scope of divine justice. This was not merely punishment, but education, designed to teach him truths about the nature of existence that his earthly cleverness had obscured. The first push required every ounce of strength that his spirit possessed, the stone moving with agonizing slowness up the impossible slope. Each inch of progress demanded supreme effort. Each foot of advance brought him closer to the exhaustion that would make the next step even more difficult. Yet something in his eternal nature compelled him to continue, to strain against the massive weight with determination that exceeded rational explanation. As he climbed, Sisyphus found his mind reviewing the events that had brought him to this pass, analyzing each decision and its consequences with the bitter wisdom that came too late to serve any useful purpose. He saw now how his cleverness had become its own trap, how each successful manipulation had led to greater challenges that required even more audacious schemes to overcome. The pattern was clear in retrospect. His intelligence had indeed been extraordinary, his achievements genuinely impressive, his victories against impossible odds undeniably real. Yet all of it had served merely to elevate him to heights from which the inevitable fall would be more catastrophic, more complete, more eternal than anything that ordinary failure could have produced. The summit of the mountain seemed impossibly distant when he began, yet gradually, through effort that transcended normal limits of endurance, Sisyphus began to make genuine progress up the slope. The stone, massive as it was, yielded to his supreme exertion, rolling slowly but steadily toward the peak that would mark the completion of his task. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions, began to stir in his consciousness as the summit drew nearer. Then, at the moment when success lay within reach, when the peak of the mountain was mere inches away, and one final push would complete his labors, the divine enchantment activated with casual cruelty. The stone seemed to develop a life of its own, its weight suddenly shifting in ways that made control impossible. Despite his desperate efforts to maintain his grip, despite straining every fiber of his eternal being to prevent the inevitable, Sisyphus felt the boulder slipping from his grasp. The stone rolled backward with gathering momentum, tumbling down the slope he had climbed with such terrible effort, bouncing and crashing until it came to rest at the exact position where his labors had begun. In that moment of ultimate frustration, watching the fruit of his supreme effort vanishing in mere seconds, Sisyphus understood the true nature of his punishment with devastating clarity. This was not merely eternal labor, but eternal futility, not simply endless work, but endless meaninglessness. He would spend eternity repeating the same task, achieving the same near success, experiencing the same crushing disappointment, forever trapped in a cycle that offered neither progress nor release. His cleverness, which had once solved every problem and overcome every obstacle, was now revealed as completely useless against the simple reality of divine justice. Yet even as this realization crashed over him like waves against an unyielding shore, Sisyphus found himself walking back down the mountain toward the stone that awaited his next attempt. Something in his nature, perhaps the same drive that had led him to build a Fiera from nothing and challenge the gods themselves, compelled him to continue despite the obvious futility of his efforts. As he placed his hands against the boulder for the second time, beginning the labor that would define his existence for all eternity, Sisyphus experienced a strange transformation of consciousness. The anger and despair that had initially overwhelmed him gradually gave way to something approaching acceptance, not of his fate, but of the reality that his fate would not change, regardless of his emotional response to it. The second ascent was no easier than the first, requiring the same supreme effort and yielding the same agonizing progress toward a summit that remained as distant as ever. Yet this time, Sisyphus climbed with fuller understanding of what awaited him, and when the stone inevitably rolled back to its starting position, he was prepared for the disappointment that followed. Time in Tartarus moved according to laws that bore no resemblance to mortal chronology, making it impossible to measure how long his labors continued, or how many times the pattern repeated itself. There was only the stone, the mountain, the endless cycle of effort and failure that defined his existence beyond any possibility of variation or escape. Gradually, over periods that might have been years or centuries or eons, Sisyphus began to notice subtle changes in his relationship to the task that consumed his eternal existence. The physical effort required remained as extreme as ever, the futility as absolute, the disappointment as crushing. Yet something in his attitude toward these realities had begun to shift in ways that he could not entirely explain. Perhaps it was the ultimate rebellion of consciousness against meaninglessness, or perhaps it was simply the inevitable adaptation of intelligence to unchangeable circumstances. Whatever the cause, Sisyphus found himself developing a kind of grim satisfaction in the perfection of his technique, the efficiency of his movements, the gradual understanding of how to extract maximum effect from minimum effort. He began to study the stone with scientific precision, learning its exact weight and balance, discovering the optimal points of leverage and the most effective angles of approach. He mapped every inch of the mountain's slope, identifying the terrain features that would help or hinder his progress, developing strategies that might shave precious seconds from each ascent. The irony was not lost on him that his legendary intelligence, which had proved so useless against the fundamental reality of divine justice, could still find ways to improve his performance within the constraints of his punishment. He could not escape his fate, could not achieve genuine success, could not break the cycle that bound him, but he could perfect his approach to failure, could find meaning in the process even when the outcome remained forever beyond reach. In time, though time itself had little meaning in the depths of Tartarus, Sisyphus's labors attracted the attention of other inhabitants of the underworld's deepest pit. Tantalus, forever reaching for fruit that remained just beyond his grasp, called out words of bitter encouragement during brief respites in their respective torments. Ixion, bound to his wheel of fire, offered philosophical commentary on the nature of eternal punishment that resonated with Sisyphus's own growing understanding of his situation. But it was the arrival of living visitors that marked the true transformation of Sisyphus from condemned criminal into eternal symbol. Heroes undertaking journeys to the underworld, poets seeking inspiration from the depths of human experience, and prophets pursuing visions of ultimate truth all found their way to the pit where the king of Ephyra labored with his impossible stone. The first of these witnesses was Odysseus himself, the hero whose parentage had long been whispered to include Sisyphus's bloodline, whose legendary cunning bore striking resemblance to the intelligence that had made the king of Ephyra both famous and infamous. When the wandering king descended to the underworld seeking counsel from the dead, his path inevitably led to the sight that would haunt his memory for the remainder of his extraordinary life. Odysseus found Sisyphus in the midst of yet another ascent, straining against the massive boulder with effort that seemed to exceed the limits of what any spirit, mortal or immortal, should be able to sustain. The sight struck the hero with force that transcended mere sympathy, revealing something fundamental about the nature of existence that his own struggles had only begun to illuminate. I saw the shade of Sisyphus in torment, Odysseus would later tell those who listened to his tales, bearing a huge stone with both hands. Leaning forward with hands and feet, he would thrust the stone up toward a ridge. But when it was about to go over the top, the mighty weight would turn it back, and once again, toward the plain, the pitiless stone would roll. But he would strain again and thrust it back, and sweat poured down from his limbs, and dust rose up about his head. The image burned itself into Odysseus's consciousness with the clarity of ultimate revelation, a vision of human striving reduced to its most essential elements. Here was effort without achievement, intelligence without advantage, determination without hope. Yet somehow, impossibly, the effort continued. The lesson was both terrible and magnificent, a demonstration of what mortal will could endure, even when stripped of all possibility of success. As Odysseus departed from Tartarus, carrying with him the memory of Sisyphus's eternal labor, the king of Ephyra achieved a kind of immortality that exceeded anything his earthly ambitions had imagined. His story would be told and retold across generations, his image invoked whenever mortals sought to understand the relationship between human effort and cosmic justice, his name becoming synonymous with the struggle against impossible odds. The spring that still flowed in Ephyra, the city that continued to prosper through the networks he had created, the descendants who carried forward his bloodline, all of these testified to genuine achievements that death and divine punishment could not entirely erase. Yet it was his failure, his eternal labor with the meaningless stone, that would define his legacy for all time. In the depths of Tartarus, as he continued his endless task with the grim persistence that had defined his entire extraordinary existence, Sisyphus became something more than the sum of his crimes and punishments. He became a symbol of the human condition itself, forever striving against forces beyond comprehension or control, forever discovering that the effort itself was the only meaning that existence could provide. The boulder rolled back down the mountain once more, and Sisyphus began his descent to retrieve it, his movements automatic after countless repetitions, yet somehow retaining traces of the dignity that had marked his reign as king of Ephyra. At the base of the mountain, he placed his hands once again against the stone that would occupy him for all eternity, feeling its familiar weight and texture, preparing for another ascent that would end in the same inevitable failure. Yet in that moment of beginning, in the eternal present where his punishment unfolded without variation or hope of reprieve, Sisyphus achieved a victory that divine justice had never intended to grant him. He had become eternal, not through the clever schemes that had defined his mortal existence, but through the simple act of enduring, of continuing, of refusing to surrender his essential humanity even in the face of cosmic indifference. The stone began its slow journey up the mountain once more, pushed by hands that would never tire and guided by intelligence that would never stop seeking better ways to accomplish an impossible task. Behind him, the shadows of Tartarus stretched into darkness beyond measurement, while ahead the summit beckoned with the same false promise it had offered countless times before. But Sisyphus no longer climbed toward the summit. He climbed because climbing was what remained to him, what defined him, what made him eternally and recognizably himself, despite the transformation that divine justice had wrought upon his spirit. In accepting the stone, he had found the only freedom that remained available to him, the freedom to choose his attitude toward circumstances that no choice could change. The echo of his labors resonated through the depths of the underworld and beyond, carrying to the surface world, where mortals still struggled with their own impossible stones, their own unreachable summits, their own eternal labors that defined the human condition. His story had become their story, his fate a mirror reflecting the ultimate futility and magnificent persistence that marked every mortal life. And so Sisyphus continues still, pushing his boulder up the mountain of eternity, achieving nothing yet achieving everything, defeated by divine justice, yet victorious over meaninglessness itself. The king of Ephora had sought to outwit the gods and had instead become something far more valuable, an eternal testament to the magnificent absurdity of human striving in a cosmos that offers effort as its own reward. The stone rolls upward, inch by impossible inch, carrying with it the weight of all mortal ambition and the lightness of acceptance that transcends understanding. At the summit waits the inevitable failure, and at the base waits the inevitable return. Between them stretches the eternal moment where Sisyphus labors, neither hoping nor despairing, but simply enduring in the only way that consciousness can endure, by continuing to be itself against all odds and despite all consequences. His legacy rippled outward from the depths of Tartarus, like waves from a stone cast into still water, touching every corner of the mortal world where his story was told and retold. In the councils of kings, his name became a byword. For the dangers of excessive ambition, a cautionary tale about the limits of mortal cleverness when set against divine authority. Yet in the hearts of common people, those who labored daily with their own heavy burdens and impossible tasks, Sisyphus became something, approaching a patron saint of persistence, a symbol that even the gods could not break the human spirit that refused to surrender. Poets found in his eternal labor a metaphor that captured truths about existence that no direct statement could convey. The image of the man pushing his stone up the endless mountain spoke to something fundamental in the human experience, the sense that all effort might ultimately prove futile, yet remained somehow necessary, somehow dignifying, somehow worth the cost it extracted from those who undertook it. Philosophers debated the meaning of his punishment, some seeing it as evidence of cosmic cruelty, while others found in it proof of cosmic justice perfectly calibrated to the crime. The more thoughtful among them recognized that both interpretations might be true simultaneously, that divine justice might operate according to principles that exceeded human understanding, while still serving purposes that human reason could dimly perceive. In the schools where young princes learned the arts of kingship, teachers used the story of Sisyphus to illustrate the importance of humility, the dangers of hubris, and the ultimate subordination of mortal authority to divine will. Yet those same students often found themselves secretly admiring the audacity that had led one man to challenge the very foundations of cosmic order, to achieve victories that no rational mind should have believed possible, to live and die entirely on his own terms, despite the terrible price such independence demanded. The spring that still bubbled in what had once been Ephyra, but was now called Corinth, served as a permanent reminder of Sisyphus's one enduring victory over divine authority. Travelers who drank from its waters carried the story to distant lands, spreading the tale of the king who had bargained with gods and won concessions that would outlast empires. The irony was perfect and profound. His greatest success had survived while his greatest failure continued eternally, both serving as testimonies to the complex relationship between mortal ambition and cosmic justice. In the temples where priests offered sacrifices to ensure divine favor, the name of Sisyphus was invoked as an example of what befell those who forgot their proper place in the cosmic order. Yet even these warnings carried undertones of admiration for the sheer scope of his achievements, the unprecedented nature of his victories, the magnificent scale of both his success and his downfall. The merchants who followed the trade routes he had established continued to prosper, their caravans and ships carrying goods through channels that his intelligence had first identified and his diplomacy had secured. The political arrangements he had negotiated continued to shape relationships between kingdoms generations after his death, proving that mortal cleverness, properly applied, could indeed create changes that outlasted the lifespan of their creator. Yet it was in the darker corners of human experience that Sisyphus's influence proved most profound and lasting. Those who found themselves trapped in situations that seemed to offer no escape, who faced tasks that appeared impossible yet could not be abandoned, who struggled against forces that consistently defeated their best efforts. All of these discovered in his story a kind of companionship that transcended the boundaries between myth and reality. The slave laboring in fields that would never belong to him, the soldier fighting in wars that seemed to accomplish nothing, the mother caring for children who would grow up to face the same struggles she had endured, all found in Sisyphus's eternal labor a reflection of their own experiences that somehow made those experiences more bearable. If the king of Ephyra could continue his impossible task with dignity intact, if he could find meaning in meaninglessness and purpose in futility, then perhaps ordinary mortals could do the same with their own more modest but equally persistent struggles. As centuries passed and the immediate political circumstances that had shaped Sisyphus's life faded into historical obscurity, his story underwent a curious transformation. The specific details of his crimes, the betrayal of Zeus, the violation of hospitality, the binding of death, gradually became less important than the universal elements of his experience. The struggle against impossible odds, the refusal to surrender despite hopeless circumstances, the discovery that effort itself could provide meaning, even when success remained forever beyond reach. The boulder he pushed became every burden that consciousness was compelled to bear. The mountain he climbed became every challenge that life presented to those brave enough or foolish enough to attempt overcoming it. The eternal repetition of his task became the daily renewal of hope and effort that marked every mortal existence, the constant beginning again that defined the human condition more accurately than any philosophical treatise. In the depths of Tartarus, unaware of the legacy that bore his name across the surface world, Sisyphus continued his eternal labor with the same meticulous attention to technique that had characterized all his endeavors. The stone required his complete concentration, demanding constant adjustment of grip and stance and leverage to maintain the slow progress up the mountain's slope. Yet even as his hands and shoulders and back strained against the massive weight, his mind remained free to roam across the memories and insights that comprised his true treasure. He thought often of Ephyra in its prime, when the harbor filled with ships from distant lands, and the marketplace bustled with traders speaking dozens of languages. The satisfaction of those years remained untarnished by subsequent events, a golden thread of genuine achievement that neither death nor divine punishment could sever. He had built something magnificent from nothing but ambition and intelligence, had created prosperity and security for thousands of people, had left behind a legacy of actual accomplishment that would endure regardless of his personal fate. He remembered Merope not as the divine collaborator in his deceptions, but as the woman who had shared his bed and borne his children, who had understood his dreams and supported his ambitions even when they led toward dangerous territory. The love they had shared transcended the political calculations that had initially brought them together, becoming something genuine and valuable that divine justice had acknowledged by allowing her to remain free from the punishment that claimed him. Most surprisingly, he found himself thinking with something approaching fondness of the gods who had become his adversaries. Zeus, for all his rage at being deceived, had shown a kind of grudging respect for the mortal who had dared match wits with divine authority. Persephone's anger at being manipulated was matched by her evident admiration for the sophistication of the deception that had convinced her. Even Hades, in pronouncing the eternal sentence, had acknowledged the unprecedented nature of crimes that exceeded normal categories of transgression. The relationship between mortal and divine, Sisyphus had come to understand, was more complex than simple subordination of the weak to the strong. The gods needed mortals not merely as worshippers, but as subjects worthy of their attention, beings capable of choices and actions significant enough to merit divine intervention. In challenging cosmic authority, he had actually affirmed its importance, demonstrating through his rebellion the reality of the power he had attempted to circumvent. This insight carried profound implications that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. If the gods required worthy adversaries to give meaning to their authority, then perhaps mortal defiance served cosmic purposes even when it resulted in divine punishment. Perhaps his eternal labor was not merely retribution, but a kind of cosmic necessity, a demonstration that the universe contained forces capable of resistance, even when resistance proved ultimately futile. The stone reached its familiar position near the summit, teetering on the edge of success that would never quite arrive. Sisyphus paused in his labors, feeling the familiar moment of tension when hope and experience warred in his consciousness. Despite knowing with absolute certainty what would happen next, despite having witnessed the same sequence countless times before, some portion of his spirit still believed that this attempt might somehow prove different. Perhaps the enchantment would fail. Perhaps divine attention would turn elsewhere. Perhaps the simple persistence of his efforts would finally overcome the cosmic forces that held him in eternal bondage. The hope was irrational, contradicted by infinite repetition, yet it persisted with the stubborn vitality that marked consciousness itself. To hope despite hopelessness was perhaps the most fundamentally human trait, the characteristic that distinguished mortals from both gods and beasts. The stone began its inevitable backward roll, gathering momentum as it tumbled down the slope toward the starting position that had become as familiar as his own reflection. Sisyphus watched its descent with eyes that held neither surprise nor despair, but rather a kind of professional interest in the precise mechanics of the process that defined his existence. Each time the pattern repeated, he learned something new about the forces involved, the angles and speeds and trajectories that shaped the stone's return journey. Such knowledge served no practical purpose, could not be applied to prevent or alter the outcome that awaited every ascent. Yet the accumulation of understanding satisfied something deep in his nature, the same drive toward comprehension that had made him a master of political intrigue and commercial strategy. Intelligence, it seemed, would continue to function even when its applications had been reduced to analyzing the details of one's own eternal futility. At the base of the mountain, the stone settled into its accustomed position, with the finality of cosmic law asserting itself. Sisyphus began his descent toward it, his movements automatic, yet somehow retaining traces of the dignity that had marked his reign as king of Ephyra. Each step downward carried him closer to the beginning of another cycle, another attempt, another demonstration that consciousness would persist in its efforts, even when those efforts had been proven meaningless by divine decree. Yet as he approached the boulder for what might have been the millionth time, or the billionth, or a number beyond mortal calculation, Sisyphus experienced something that approached contentment. Not happiness, that emotion belonged to realms where success remained possible, but a deeper satisfaction that came from perfect alignment between one's nature and one's circumstances. He was, in the most complete sense possible, exactly what he had always been, a consciousness that refused to surrender, that continued to strive regardless of obstacles, that found in effort itself the only meaning that existence required. The paradox was exquisite and profound. In seeking to escape the limitations of mortal existence, he had achieved a kind of immortality that exceeded anything his earthly ambitions had imagined. His punishment had become his purpose, his failure, his greatest success, his eternal bondage, the ultimate expression of his freedom to remain fundamentally himself, despite all attempts to change or break him. As his hands closed once more around the familiar surface of the stone, feeling its weight and texture and the terrible solidity that spoke of permanence beyond mortal understanding, Sisyphus smiled with genuine humor at the cosmic joke that had made him both victim and victor, prisoner and symbol, defeated king and eternal inspiration to all who struggled against impossible odds. The stone began its slow ascent, pushed by hands that would never tire, and guided by intelligence that would never stop seeking better ways to accomplish an impossible task. In the shadows of Tartarus, in the depths where the most heinous criminals received their eternal punishments, the laughter of a king echoed through chambers that had never heard such sound before. Sisyphus had finally understood the ultimate truth that all his cleverness had previously obscured. The meaning of existence lay not in achieving victory over cosmic forces, but in maintaining one's essential humanity despite cosmic indifference. The gods had sought to break him and had instead revealed the unbreakable core of consciousness that no external power could touch or alter. Behind him, eternity stretched into darkness beyond measurement. Ahead of him, the summit beckoned with the same false promise it had offered countless times before. Between them lay the eternal moment where effort met resistance, where will encountered limitation, where the human spirit demonstrated its magnificent refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat had been made absolute by divine decree. And in that moment, in the space between beginning and ending, that contained all of life's essential truth, Sisyphus pushed his stone toward a summit he would never reach, in pursuit of a success he would never achieve, animated by a hope that proved stronger than knowledge and more enduring than the gods themselves had imagined possible. The legend was complete, the lesson eternal, the symbol established for as long as consciousness existed, to contemplate the magnificent futility of its own persistent striving. In the depths of divine punishment, the king of Ephyra had found the ultimate kingdom, a realm where effort was its own reward and persistence its own victory, where the boulder rolled forever upward toward summits that existed not in space, but in the undying determination of the spirit that refused to surrender. Thus ends the tale of Sisyphus, whose name would echo through eternity, not as a warning against hubris, but as a testament to the invincible power of consciousness to create meaning from meaninglessness, purpose from futility, and triumph from the very completeness of defeat. In learning to push his stone, he had learned to bear the weight of existence itself, and in that learning had achieved an immortality more profound than any his earthly schemes had ever aspired to attain.